So last week we were continuing our study. I guess we can officially call this study Christianity and anti-Semitism. And we were trying to address the new term that we've introduced into our vocabulary, anti-Judaism. And this is not something that I dreamed up. This is a term that academics have been considering ever since the Holocaust. And there's this reflection looking back at how the Christian church, if any responsibility it bears with regards to what happened and has happened to the Jews over the centuries, and in particular, the Holocaust, which interestingly, where did it take place? Did it take place in Arabia or in some land where Islam predominated? The Holocaust took place in Europe. And in Germany, I remember a census in the 1930s that was taken asking for religious affiliation, and 95% of Germans in the 1930s would have identified as either Catholic or Protestant. So we have, and one of the worst persecutions of the Jewish people taking place in a country which identifies as being Christian. You can debate how Christian they were, but nonetheless, there is a connection between the church / Christianity and historic anti-Semitism and mistreatment of the Jewish people. So after the Holocaust, academic scholars, theologians started reflecting upon this, and this term anti-Judaism is now in our vocabulary in the way of trying to separate, well, we're not anti-Semitic, we're not against the Jews because of their race, their color. It's a religious difference here. So we need a new term, anti-Judaism. And this particular book I came across just in the last, last week or so. And this was released, I remember if it was 2001, and it's titled Anti-Judaism and the Fourth Gospel being the Gospel of John. And anyone remember what's unique or interesting about the book of John as far as our topic? What is unique about the Gospel of John on this particular topic in contrast to other books of the Bible?
I think your premise that you're proposing so far is that it seems to be more critical of the Jews. Okay.
And specifically, the term, the Jews, and I think it's in Greek, I may butcher it, oidoi. It's kind of a funny sounding term, but that has been translated into the English as the Jews. And John uses the term. Half the times he uses it in a derogatory or antagonistic, hostile context, whereas his peers, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, do not do that in their Gospels. So this has been highlighted, and in some sense, John's been pointed to as being, maybe the instigator, originator of this anti-Christian view of the Jewish people because of how the term the Jews is used in John. We looked through John, we looked through all the passages in question. What I'm going to do this morning, it's kind of backtracking a little bit, but what came to light when I was reading this book, Anti-Judaism, was that one of the byproducts of this, called sensitivity or maybe political correctness within Christianity regarding how the Bible portrays the Jews, one of the byproducts is a Bible translation called the Contemporary English Version. Has anyone heard of the CEV? Okay. It came out in, I think it was 1995. And what's interesting or unique about this English translation is kind of a paraphrase type translation. It's not a literal word for word. But what's interesting about this translation is that it tries to reduce the confusion or the possible misunderstanding that could result in the book of John. Actually, it's not just limited to John. They do this throughout the New Testament. They do something unique when they encounter these instances of, in the Greek, referring to the Jews. So what I wanted to do was go back and look at the passages in John, and I'm going to show you how the text reads in the King James, and then look at how it's been rendered in the CEV, the Contemporary English Version. So if we do this, starting the first occurrence of where we find a negative reference to the Jews in John, it's John 5, and in the King James we have, the Jews therefore said unto him that was cured, it is the Sabbath day, it is not lawful for thee to carry thy bed, and therefore did the Jews persecute Jesus and sought to slay him because he had done these things on the Sabbath day. Now we all know that the entire Jewish people did not try persecuting Jesus. This is a reference to the religious leaders. Well, the CEV recognizes that. So what do? Well, in their translation, the CEV reads or renders it, when the Jewish leaders saw the man carrying the mat, they said to him, this is the Sabbath, no one is allowed to carry a mat on the Sabbath. And then instead of referring to or translating the Greek into the Jews, which is what the Greek text actually says, the CEV says they just simply use the pronoun they, which is supposed to be a reference back to verse 10, the Jewish leaders. The Jewish leaders, they started making a lot of trouble for Jesus because he did things like this on the Sabbath. So this is what the CEV is, how it's responding or how it's treating the phrase the Jews in the text. So this is our first example. The next one, still in John, the King James says, therefore the Jews sought the more to kill him because he not only had broken the Sabbath, but said also that God was his father, making himself equal to God. And in the CEV, we have now the leaders wanted to kill Jesus for two reasons. So they're trying to be more precise. It'd probably be to sum up in two words what the CEV is doing. They're trying to be more precise on how to translate the Jews. Next instance, John 7, King James, after these things, Jesus walked in Galilee, for he would not walk in Jewry because the Jews sought to kill him. The CEV says that Jesus decided to leave Judea and to start going through Galilee because the Jewish leaders wanted to kill him. I mean, you can congratulate or you can definitely see how the CEV is trying to pin the antagonism on a specific group, and that is the Jewish leaders here. In John chapter 8, King James says, then said the Jews unto him, thou art not yet 50 years old, and thou hast seen Abraham. And the CEV says, you are not even 50 years old. And then even instead of using the Jews, it says, they said, how could you have seen Abraham? And if you read the entire context of 8, you'll see that the reference to they is either the Pharisees or the people that were present. John chapter 9, but the Jews, in King James, but the Jews did not believe concerning him that he had been blind. This is referring to the blind man who Jesus had healed. And he received his sight until they called the parents of him who had received his sight. The CEV says, but the Jewish leaders would not believe that the man had been born blind. John chapter 9, these words spake his parents, so the parents of the blind man was brought forward before the religious leaders, and yet King James has, because they feared the Jews, for the Jews had agreed already that if any man did confess that he was Christ, he should be put out of the synagogue. CEV narrows it and puts a finger on specifically the Jewish leaders, the leaders. John 10, then the Jews took the stones up again to stone him. The Jews answered him, saying, so forth and so on. But CEV has, again, the Jewish leaders, and then the pronoun in verse 33, they answered. John chapter 11, his disciples say unto him, Master, the Jews of late sought to stone thee. And in the CEV, teacher, they said, the people there want to stone you. John 18, and from thenceforth Pilate sought to release him, but the Jews cried out, saying, if you let this man go, thou art not Caesar's friend. CEV, then Pilate wanted to set Jesus free, but the crowd again yelled. So very narrow, it's a narrowing of the antagonists of Jesus. John 19, and after this, Joseph of Arimathea, being a disciple of Jesus, but secretly for fear of the Jews, CEV, as a reference to, was afraid of the Jewish leaders. John chapter 20, then the same day at the evening, being the first day of the week, when the doors were shut, where the disciples were assembled for fear of the Jews, the CEV, the disciples were afraid of the Jewish leaders. Okay, so those are the examples in John where John uses the term the Jews in a derogatory, antagonistic, negative context. And you'll see what the CEV attempted to do. This started in 1995, but it was interesting. The trend kind of, well, what they did started a bit of a trend. As you can see, these translations, the dynamic translations, which is a way of talking about more kind of like a paraphrasic translation as opposed to a literal word for word. There were several of these dynamic translations that came into being after what the CEV did in 1995. So if you have a New Century Version, the Common English Bible, an International Standard Version, or the New Living Translation, you will see this happening in your translation where the translators are trying to avoid any misunderstanding or painting with too broad of a brush the antagonists. And interestingly, the only literal, kind of like a word-for-word translation I could find that came something close to what you see in the CEV is the English Standard Version, which is the successor to the Revised Standard Version. What's interesting about the English Standard Version, they can't, because they're a literal word-for-word translation, they cannot insert words that are not in the text. And again, all those instances I showed you are insertions by the English translator, inserting English words where they do not exist in the Greek text. So the English Standard Version did something different. What they did was put footnotes. They would put a little number behind the Jews, and then down in the footnote, they would try to clarify, specifically it was the Jewish leaders, or it was the crowd that was present. So I thought that was interesting. I want to bring that to your attention. I don't know. The question is, how do you feel about this? I'm going to open up the floor. Is this good? Or is this going too far? It's unnecessary. Anyone have any opinion? Any thoughts?
I think when a translator starts getting into the realm of what to think of a passage as opposed to what the passage says, the reader runs into the danger of blindly accepting what the translator puts forth. I think what the ESV did there seems to be a better compromise because it clearly states this is an addition. You may not accept it or you might accept it.
Okay. A valid response up here.
I agree with Jason. I think it's getting into the realm of interpretation versus translation, because it is implying that the usage of that word is derogatory rather than just a factual usage.
Anyone else have an opinion?
So I agree that translators add things that they shouldn't add, or even put commentary down below. But I think that the bigger issue here is that the new Christian movement, and the Apostle Paul is a good example of this, he starts out killing Christians because he sees that as an anti-Judaism movement. It's against the beliefs of the Torah and all the other, and of course converts. And
well, it's forgive me for interrupting. It's not anti-Torah because
right. No. I mean, but he
more
looks
rabbinic interpretation and traditions of the rabbis or the
Right, well, I think Paul might have looked at this as Jesus revising certain, or expanding into areas that he didn't think the law expanded into, right? Like in the case of healing the blind man or on the
Healing
Sabbath.
on the Sabbath.
Yeah, like healing on the
Doing
Sabbath,
good.
right? He would change that. So I think that in looking at that, and maybe this is, I don't know if it's true of Judaism today, whether they look at Christianity or the Christian movement as an anti-Jewish religion in that sense. Certainly back then, the Jewish leaders are like, hey, he's going to take our power away. He's going to, we're going to lose all our power and things like that. So part of the reason why they wanted to get rid of Jesus. And then Paul tries to stop the movement too. And of course he converts, we know all that. But again, I think in that regard, you're talking about translations, Jesus would read the same text, but then he would, how do we put it, expand on it or make commentary on it? Like, hey, this is what it says. Yeah, or extrapolate. In other words, he did something that the Jewish leaders didn't like. In other words, and maybe in their mind, you added to the text.
Well, let me play the devil's advocate. I remember when I first started this, I actually started back in May, I think, when I was filling in for Jacob. But when I officially started, about 5-6 weeks ago, I had presented 7 points and asked people, do you believe the Jews are responsible for Jesus' death? And hardly anyone raised their hands, okay? And the reason seemed to be there was misgiving of blaming the entire race of Jews on Jesus' death. And yet, our texts say very clearly, the Jews, Paul says in 1 Thessalonians, says that you killed Jesus. So it's interesting, what is the motivation of these translators? It's to clarify and not paint with too broad of a brush who the antagonists of Jesus, the disciples, and the early church are. So their motivations, I think, are good. And I would think everyone, based upon their reluctance to raise their hand 6-7 weeks ago, whenever, they would agree with what, because I was hearing that it's not precise enough. It's too broad. We can't blame and yet here, when we have translators actually trying to focus, now there's pushback. Okay, now I'm totally with you as far as don't want people inserting words because they may be inaccurately portraying the message. But here it's almost like this is confirming what people here 5-6 weeks ago were actually afraid of happening, and that is painting with too broad a brush the Jewish people. So in an attempt to kind of narrow it down, this is what happens. So again, I'm just playing devil's advocate. I'm not taking sides, but I thought maybe someone might present that as maybe in support of what they're doing. Jason?
So a few weeks ago, I had brought up the instance of Daniel's prayer in Daniel chapter 9.
Right.
There is national culpability that Daniel calls out. It is the we have sinned. It is the everyone has fallen short. It is the total acceptance and asking of forgiveness for what the nation had done. Even though Daniel wasn't culpable for this, right? He puts himself in this lot because he is a Jew. He is an Israelite. So in the same vein that Daniel uses to call culpability for their sin and subsequent punishment, you might have that same verbiage used for any Jew that would be culpable for the death of Jesus in a broad national sense, even though individuals were not responsible for it, certain people were.
All right. So all these are valid points. Jessica, I think, wants to add something.
Again, I agree with Jason. I did raise my hand last time, so I don't know that I haven't. I think it's getting at changing the author's intent is the because I think the intent was what Jason said. It's a national identity, and I think inserting this changes that.
Well, in the case of your example, Daniel, when do you think that was? Like 50 years after the deportation to Babylon or so? It was, I guess, maybe toward Daniel's, later years. Yeah, if you were to write looking back, yeah, I could see that. But let's say you're a newspaper reporter, and you're writing, the accounts of John chapter 8, and this is where the Pharisees are in the temple treasury, I think, and contesting with Jesus. And it says, one time, the Pharisees, about 5 times it says the Jews, the Jews, the Jews, the Jews, the Jews. Now, if you're a newspaper reporter and you're trying to get that report out into tomorrow's newspaper, would that really, what you're describing, be an accurate way to portray what happened in John 8 yesterday? And this is where it gets a little bit fuzzy. If you're writing what's happening, it's kind of, Lisa and I were discussing this on the way in, because she said, well, what are you talking about this morning? I did. And I used the word sloppy, and she said, no, it's not sloppy, don't take that back. And I said, okay, could John have done a better job reporting this if he was a newspaper reporter when he uses the term the Jews, the Jews, the Jews? John was a Jew. Jesus was a Jew. Was it an accurate statement? And she would have to say, well, no, he could have done better. I say, okay, give me a term that's not sloppy, not careless, but it could have been more accurately represented as to, he could have said the Jewish leaders, he could have said the Pharisees again. Like in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it's always the scribes, the Herodians, the Pharisees. So I never got a response from Lisa. Maybe you all can do, I do. I know when you say, well, John was sloppy, that's like, come on, it's inspired by God. But it does, what happens is that there is this, and I'll show you in the next slide where I'm going with this, how the term the Jews, without distinguishing whether it's the leaders or the crowd, you risk of someone reading it years and years later, 50 years later, 100 years later, and they're reading it out of context. Take for granted, if you're doing your daily reading, the entire chapter, and you're reading the Bible over year after year after year, you know that it's not talking about the entire Jewish people. But if you're giving a sermon and you're just reading a small little section, and it says the Jews said, crucify him, and you repeat that story over and over again, what happens? You have the potential of blaming too large a group. Now, historically, if you step back, 200 years after the time of Christ, yes, almost, without any question, all the Jews would have said, we don't believe Jesus was the Messiah. Then you could make these big, broad, black and white statements, them versus us, the Jews versus the Christians. But at the time you're writing this, could there have been a little bit more accuracy? And that's all that these versions are trying to do, is get a little bit more accurate so that there's no possibility of something being taken out of context and the Jews as an entire race being blamed on the death of Jesus. And we're not talking about whether the Jewish people have rejected Jesus. We're talking about who killed Jesus, okay? And the blame has been, Jews for centuries are being blamed for killing Jesus, and that's just ridiculous. Okay. Walter, you're champing at the bit there.
Answer your question is no. John could do no better, because as we all know, the word is inspired by God, and it was written precisely the way he intended it to be done, that we might examine and understand it. And as you said, context is everything, because Daniel does one thing and talks about the Jews, and John says another. You cannot say they're the same thing necessarily. They're different events, different times for God writing about different things. You have to understand the context, and you have to do some Bible study and understand your Bible. You can't let these people come along and keep slowly changing the Bible to be what they want it to mean. It is what God wrote it to be.
Well, is what the CEV translating, the way they translate it, is that what the context actually means? Did they do a bad job when it's talking about the religious leaders and they translated religious leaders? Can you fault the CEV and say that's a faulty translation? I know we don't like seeing God's word changed, but is it a faulty translation? I know that not every translator's insertion of words is accurate, but in this case, did you see anything that was wrong? Robert?
I think we all agree with what's the intention of the clarification. We're told not to add to or take away from the scriptures. Walter kind of put it very well that this is the inspired word of God. I'm not familiar with that translation, but although we agree with this context and this situation, what other liberties we're taking for clarification?
We're drifting off into
But
accuracy of
that's the
translation.
slippery-
What
that's
I'm trying to
the
say
slippery
is the response to misinterpreting the phrase "the Jews," there's been an attempt to reduce the confusion that could result. That's all I'm talking about. Is that attempt, is that motivation good or bad? Is what we've seen here in these particular instances inaccurate? That's really what I want to focus on. We're going to drifting off into what accurate translations are more
I
accurate.
guess we all came to the right conclusion. I think we all came to the same conclusion without the clarification of the words, because we have done our due diligence, as Walter said, in studying our Bible. We haven't taken a shortcut and just read something to make it mean something we want it to mean. But I don't want to get in the weeds, but it's a
I
slippery
think
slope.
we need to divorce our familiarity with the scriptures, and let's say take ourselves back into the middle, let's say the Middle Ages. And you're just getting little bits and pieces from sermons. There you see where, without, if you just simply say the Jews cried out, "Crucify him, crucify him," where you could, as a listener, believe that the entire race of Jews were responsible. Because you can't go home and say, well, Mark and Luke don't say that. It's just clearly, the Pharisees raised and caused the crowd to do that. But if you're just getting your word from someone up here on the pulpit, and you've got stained glass windows which are telling the stories because you don't have a Bible, you see the potential for misunderstanding when you don't have clarification. So again, we get back to, could John have done a better job? Walter doesn't want to say yes, because that was like you're saying something's wrong with God's preservation of the Bible. But you can see what I'm trying to get at is there has been a misunderstanding, and there's been an attempt recently to try to fix that misunderstanding. That's all I'm trying to do. I'm playing devil's advocate because I just wanted to hear the other side or present the other side. So I'm just giving you what has happened with regards to modern translations on this particular topic. Jacob?
Brother Paul Martin brought out an interesting point in his notes where he was talking about the idea that if you do not do something, in doing so, you have taken an action. If you do not say something, you have, and so said something. And in that regards, the Jews as a whole, by not saying Jesus is the Messiah, as trying to rebel against the Jewish leaders, they were complicit. And I think that's something that you have talked often enough about, was that the Jews were, as a nation, complicit in not choosing to accept Jesus as their Messiah because of fear of the Jewish leaders or because of whatever have you. The Jews were, in that regards, complicit. I think there is, in relation to the idea of what these translations are doing, I feel like in some regards, we would appreciate a translator who would actually give us a version of the Bible that would not say devil, or would not say Satan, or who would not put other words that we now have to go through and deal with the why do we believe this compared to the rest of the Christian world. And it is, I think that in those regards, there would be a propensity or desire to have that. But because we have read our Bibles and because we have that understanding, I don't think we are as concerned about the idea of, oh, the Jews, the Jews, the Jews, because we have that locked in fairly easy. We can easily come up with a good explanation to whoever we're talking
Again,
about.
we're so familiar, we're just immersed in Scripture that we know better. But again, we're not talking about today, we're talking about historically Christianity. if called guilt or role in anti-Semitism.
Yeah. So, very simply, the Romans literally killed Christ. Get that, everyone should have that straight in their mind. The Jews had no way that they were even legally allowed to do that. But what they were is their leaders egged them on and became complicit in the decision to kill him. And as Jacob mentioned, the people did not revolt and say, hey, no, this is a good and just man. We shouldn't be doing this. So that's the reality of things that no one wants to see. Because the last thing the Roman Catholic Church wants to hear is that the Romans, or the Roman people, killed Christ. Because that kind of messes with their plan for things.
I mean, there's no question that the Romans were the agents of the religious leaders. If the Jewish people weren't under Roman rule, it probably would have been, maybe like Stephen's outcome. And they could have stoned Jesus, and they tried multiple times. They just decided it'd be maybe more efficient to get the Romans to do this if they could bring an accusation against Jesus. That would have been threat to the Roman system. But anyway, interesting discussion. We've got those translations. Now, again, why are they doing this? To avoid confusion. And here I said, I'm going to give you an example of confusion that results. So, no one here, I'm sure, has ever heard of Willibald Beischlag. He was a German Luther pastor, and he was a professor of practical theology and New Testament exegesis at Martin Luther University in Germany in the late 1800s. And he wrote several books, including this 2-volume work called the New Testament or New Testament Theology. And it's pretty dry. I don't recommend you go out and get a copy, although you can get it for free online. But I was flipping through this. I was chasing a particular bibliographic reference, and I came across a specific passage which shows you how even super educated, you don't have to be a medieval serf, attending a mass in the Middle Ages. Even in the enlightened 19th century, a super educated academic, those teaching in universities, and those who know better, you can see how, and I will this time use the word sloppily, how they sloppily throw around the word the Jews in a negative and irresponsible manner. Now, this particular work, it's not an anti-Semitic work whatsoever. Again, it's rather dry academic. It's just describing theology, Christian theology, New Testament theology. But in making reference to John chapter 8, he does something here. And this simply, again, stresses why there's a problem with just leaving the Jews hanging. So hopefully you can see this. I kind of zoomed in on the section. And this educated man writes, the Jews are no children of Abraham because they do not the works of Abraham. They are not the children of God, but of the devil, because lying and murder is their nature. This is being written some 18 centuries after, the New Testament. Professor, and he's using the term the Jews, and he's making reference to John chapter 8. And he's saying the Jews are the children of the devil. Now we could argue he's using the term as we find it in the text. But what happens when you use the term exactly as you find it in the text, and you're careless? You end up portraying the Jews in the 18th century as the children of the devil. Okay? This is just one small example of what can happen when you don't get precise with how you use words. And this is, again, a motivation why English translators are moving toward being more precise when they encounter the phrase the Jews in the Greek text. Is it a good thing? Again, we can debate. So, back to our term anti-Judaism. Here's a new question regarding this term. If we go back to the first century, would we find anti-Judaism Remember what anti-Judaism is: simply opposed to the Jewish way of life, which includes their religion. If you go back to the first century, could you find anti-Judaism, people who hold to anti-Judaism, those who would be against Judaism, could you find it outside of the Christian community in the first century? Could you find other groups than the Christians having anti-Judaism thoughts or holding anti-Judaism views in the first century outside the Christian church? Yes or no? Jacob?
Well, I would say for anyone who enjoys the taste of bacon, which would have been most of the world at that time, the fact that the Jews would not have eaten bacon would have been, for them, a reason to be anti that Jewish mindset. And I know it's a silly example, but there were ways that the Jews were very different from the rest of the world, the rest of the Gentile world. And so for, I would say, almost every nation that was not, in at least some regards, accepting of some of the thought processes of the Jews and why they had their laws, why they cleaned and washed the way they did, would have been anti the Jewish way of living.
Okay. So your short answer is yes. There would be groups outside the Christians who would be opposed to Judaism. And using one word, you could say the Romans, right? That includes everybody outside Judaism. One large group, the Romans. The Romans didn't care about Judaism. There was no reason to protest against Judaism or the Jewish way of life. I mean, they had their own pantheon of gods. The Romans had their own religion. The Romans weren't interested in telling them how to worship, how to live their lives differently. As long as the Jews paid their taxes and respected the Roman emperor and his minions, the Romans left the Jews and their religion alone, unless it somehow stirred up violence, and then the Romans would get involved. But it was, if you remove the violence and they peacefully practice their, however they wish to, worship their God, the Romans weren't opposed to that. You can have your Moses, we don't need it. We have Plato, we have Olympus, we have our own system. The Romans are happy with what they have. The Romans would be anti-Judaism. Now, when you look at the Christians, there is this conflict very early on between the Jewish community and the Christians. What's kind of funny here is that early on, though, most of the Christians, if not all, were Jews. So it's hard to throw the word anti-Judaism to apply to someone like Paul or John. Paul, he took a Nazirite vow, had his hair grow long. He wanted to be back to Jerusalem on, was it Pentecost, I think, because he wanted to keep that particular Jewish holiday. I can't believe that John, after he became a follower of Jesus, or after Jesus went into heaven, I can't believe that John started eating bacon or started celebrating Christmas. So you've got this period where you have Christians who are actually practicing keeping some of the Jewish ways of life. So when would the term anti-Judaism even come into play? In fact, you might, again, look back and say the Romans would be more anti-Judaism than the early Christians would be. But as time progressed and it became a Gentile faith, basically, and Judaism had, or Jews, the Jewish people had rejected Messiah, Jesus being Messiah, well, then we can start seeing anti-Judaism perhaps being a useful term. But what I'm trying to get at is what you see in John and what you see in Acts with how the term the Jews is used. You cannot bring out anti-Judaism and say, well, that's the answer. It isn't the answer. There's something else going on. It's not anti-Semitism. It's not anti-Judaism, what we see happening in John and in Acts. And we're running out of time. Jacob, do you want to say something, or are you just trying to flag me?
Well, no, I just had an interesting thought in relation to the fact that Peter is one of the biggest advocates for lessening the law's restriction on the Gentiles, right? Because all the very strong Jews in Christianity at the very beginning, they wanted to try to push on the entire law of Moses upon these new converts, the Gentiles, right? And so Paul does a very important job of saying, no, we don't need to enforce all of these. We can boil it down to just a couple of things. They boiled it down to abstaining meat sacrificed to idols. They abstained it, sexual immorality, and a couple other things that they said, all right, this is just all we ask of you from our Judeo way of living that we want you to carry over and accept as now Christians. And I think in that way, instead of making them have to do all the feasts, all the festivals, and everything else that the Jews had to do, they were in some ways anti-Judaism because they were not trying to promote and push on the whole entirety of the law, but only just a few small things.
Yeah. I think you just simply confirm you've got this gray period, this fuzzy period, where if you have Jews who are following Jesus, and it's like, what do you do with your way of life? You know, Hanukkah. You give up Hanukkah. You give up your dietary habits. So all I'm trying to point out is that anti-Judaism is a useful term. We definitely need to have it in our vocabulary, but it does not explain what we see happening in the books of John and the books and the Acts of Apostles. So we'll leave it there, unless someone has a question.